special edition of Biz Talk. I'm Lulu. Today we will focus on China's path to modernization, particularly in light of the recent Two Sessions policy-setting meeting. As China continues to make strides towards building a modern socialist country, it is crucial to gain further clarity on the country's way forward in its modernization drive. And we will explore the reasons behind China's shift from following the Western paradigm to developing its own path of modernization that is suitable for the nation. We will also discuss how this approach is being received by the world and what specific policies are in place to ensure that the key targets of the Chinese modernization are achieved. And joining me today are our distinguished guests. Let me introduce them to you. Ms. Aphrodite Bletas, President of the Hellenic Chinese Business Chamber. Welcome to the show, Ms. Bletas. And here with me in the studio, we have Mr. Victor Gao, Chair Professor of Soochow University. Always good to have you with us, Mr. Gao. And we have another guest, Mr. John Ross, who will be joining us from London in just a bit. But let's start our discussion. I would like to start with you, Mr. Gao. Help us to better understand the term of Chinese modernization, and also in particular, what factors do you think contribute to China's confidence in choosing its own path of modernization, and what the problems that China has discovered from the Western model?
Well, you know for sure that ever since 1978, China has embarked upon a pathway of reform and opening to the outside world. And in a matter of 4 decades, China has now become the second largest economy if we use official exchange rate as the benchmark, and China is already the largest economy if we use purchasing power parity as the benchmark. So there is no denying that China has achieved a huge economic and political transformation in China, which benefited not only the Chinese people, but also the rest of the world as a whole. Therefore, when we talk about modernization in China, we have the track record. We have all the evidences to prove that China is still in the process of achieving a more enhanced form, more reinforced form of modernization. I think it is time for China as well as the rest of the world to sit down and really think about what does this Chinese modernization mean? What is the roadmap for Chinese modernization, and whether this Chinese model, this Chinese precedent, has any relevance to many other countries which also face the challenge of modernization. In a sense, I would say China's modernization over the past 4 decades or so is very much based on several things. One is maintaining peace. China wants to maintain peace not only in our part of the world, but also promoting peace in other parts of the world. Secondly, maintaining stability, because we are convinced that without stability at home, you really cannot expect to develop your economy, to improve the living standards of the people. Now, the other thing is also very important. That is, development is the hard truth, meaning we need to channel all the resources of the people, all walks of life, to development. Because if you do not develop, if you do not grow, and if the government does not create a framework enabling people to grow, then by the end of the day, you cannot expect that the living standards of the people will be improved. So I think by maintaining all these key elements, in a matter of 4 decades or so, China has been completely transformed. And I think other countries in the world all express curiosity and interest as to how China can do this, whether I can learn something from China, whether I can engage China on equal terms to exchange ideas and compare notes, for example, so that many other countries, especially in the emerging economy, can also get their acts together and improve the living standards of their people in their respective way.
So China has been exploring its own ways, but for a long time China had been learning from the West. So what are some of the factors that China discovered in the Western model that China believes is not suitable for its own?
Oh, if we compare the Chinese modernization with, let's say, the G7 nations and many others in the developed countries, I would say there are sharp contrasts. First of all, if you look at G7, the United States, United Kingdom, and other countries, for example, then ever since they embarked upon the pathway to achieve modernization and industrialization, they have been involved in so many other things. For example, colonization, extinguishing the American Indian population, for example, which is probably the largest crime against humanity in a sense, and then enslaving the Africans for centuries, and even after the abolition of slavery as a result of the Civil War in the United States in the early 1980s, discrimination against the Afro-Americans continued for more than 100 years. Even today, the white supremacism, for example, in the United States, and the discrimination against the Afro-Americans, other minorities, is still very deeply rooted. And then the United States engaging in war after war in many parts of the world, plundering other countries' resources, etc. Now, comparing the Chinese modernization, one thing stands out. That is, for more than 4 decades, China has been pursuing a pathway of peace, meaning we do not engage in wars of occupation or aggression against either neighboring countries or in other parts of the world. We have become the most fearsome and effective advocate for peace. So China pursues peace, whereas in many other countries in the developed world, either in today's time or in their history, for example, they actually agitated for war, and wars of conquest, of occupation, of invasion, etc. Now, the other thing is that China has achieved its economic transformation by engaging with every other country in the world on equal terms. China is a big country, big population. However, when we promote trade with any country, big or small, we always deal with them on an equal basis. And the trade between China and the rest of the world is always on a mutually beneficial basis. Now, China by today is already the largest trading partner with more than 130 countries and regions in the world. And if you look at each of these countries that China trades with, of course, sometimes China has surplus, sometimes huge surplus, and sometimes China has deficits, for example. But our goal is really to promote more balanced trade. So if there is a trade imbalance, for example, we want to really talk with these trading nations so that eventually China can buy more things. For example, for the past 5 years or so, China has been promoting the China Import-Export. This is unprecedented in the whole world. And this is really being driven by the fact that China wants to make sure that in promoting trade with all the other countries, for example, we can achieve a more balanced trade. Now, in this way, again, allow me to emphasize one point. China's modernization has a very important component part, that is the international trade. And in promoting trade, China is not using sharp elbows, for example, to force other countries to buy our Chinese-made products. China is not, for example, forcing other multinationals to move their capacities to China. No, every foreign company operating in China, which, there is a multitude of them, they come to China willingly, on their own volition. And they've done their own due diligence, they've done their homework, and eventually, for example, their operations in China not only contribute a lot to China's modernization, but also generate huge profit for these companies. So China's modernization, in a sense, is a win for China, is a win for the rest of the world, and we are also very grateful to so many multinational companies and foreign companies which have set up operations in China and contributed a lot to our modernization.
So China's modernization eventually will benefit not only China, of course, the world, and all its economic and trade partners as well. So, and I think we have our another guest with us right now. Yeah, I would like to introduce him to our audience. We also have online joining us Mr. John Ross, who is a senior fellow at Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies of Renmin University, and he is also the former director of economic and business policy for the mayor of London. And always a pleasure to have you on the show, Mr. Ross. So, let's give Mr. Ross a few seconds before he figures out his technical problems, so I can't really hear him right now. But right now, let me go back to Mr. Gao. So we were thinking that since China's reform and opening up in 1978, China has been, for the first few, let's say, years or decades, learning a lot from the Western way of, developing its economy. However, China is developing its own path right now. And of course, we are two very different systems. However, some people in the West view China's differences as a threat. What do you have to say to that?
No, I think these kind of suspicions and agonies, for example, by some of the Western countries, first of all, they are barking at the wrong tree. Secondly, there are, of course, differences between China and many other countries in the world, including the developed countries. But these differences should not divide us. These differences should actually enrich the both sides of the equation. If anyone believes that China, with its 5,000 years of history uninterrupted, which is really unparalleled in the world, can be exactly the same as the United States or any European countries or other countries in the part of the world, that's indulging in fantasy. Because China has been unique, has been extraordinary, has been special for 5,000 years. And I will not be surprised if China will continue to be different, special, and extraordinary in its own way compared with the rest of the world for another 5,000 years. But such differences should really contribute to multilateralism. Because if the whole world only has one facial expression, one color, for example, one mode of thinking, that will be a very dull world. I think the world will be more enriched if we have differences, if we have different culture, different civilization, and different ways of thinking things, and different ways of contributing to economic vitality of the world. Now, the other thing is that if we look at some of the Western countries, I think they need to come to the conclusion that some of the ways they have been embracing simply do not work. Let me give you one example. We know in 2022, the United Kingdom pushed forward a proposal called a mini budget, which became an instant fiasco. Everyone condemned it, and it resulted in huge damage to the US, to the UK financial integrity, causing losses of all kinds, the plunging of the pound, you name it. I would say in the Chinese system, which we call whole process democracy, such disaster would never happen. Why? Because the Chinese legislative process is very complicated, very sophisticated, and it involved almost all the stakeholders in the process. The final decision would never be made by a very small group of people, as if they had the truth, as if whatever they decide should be imposed on top of the rest of the population. And I would say it is time for countries like United Kingdom to sit down and to reflect as to whether, for example, my way of doing things, my system, my values, which is a word they constantly use these days, have some shortcomings or insufficiencies, for example, whether they can really sit down and in a very pragmatic, realistic way to look at the Chinese way of doing things. Because if we compare economic achievements, there is no denying that China has achieved huge successes, much greater successes compared with the United States, Japan, the United Kingdom, for example, almost all the OECD countries. There must be a reason. I think if the United States and many Western countries do not get to the bottom of this situation, if they keep barking at the wrong tree, first of all, it's not constructive. Secondly, it's not going to help them solve their own problems, because China has figured out a pathway which is very productive, very efficient, and is constantly being re-amended and readapted to the changing circumstances and challenges and opportunities. So if they do not want to look up at a higher level of governance, standards, for example, if they want to indulge in fantasy that their way is the best way, if they want to believe that they are in possession of truth, nothing but the truth, the total truth, then the real truth, which is ever changing, will leave them behind. And I think the rest of the world will conclude that, wow, China has demonstrated huge amount of economic achievements. There must be something working right. Now, in my view, the Western system seems to be a vehicle with all the four wheels lined up in opposing directions. Whereas in China, this vehicle or automobile also has four wheels, but the four wheels are lined up in the same direction, generating huge efficiency and efficacy and productivity. This is how China has really emancipated its own economic achievements over the past 4 decades, and this will be continuing the enabler for the China's continued economic development. And to that extent, I think China and the rest of the world can really sit down on equal terms, compare notes, and figure out whether there is a better way for many countries in the world.
Great points there. I would like to hear from other guests what they think of their understanding of China's modernization. Let me go to Mr. Ross first. Mr. Ross, so we were discussing this. So for a long time, China had been learning from the West, especially in developing economy, in opening up markets. It has been gradually exploring its own way of development. Some in the West do see China's different mentality as a challenge. What do you make of this mentality, and do you see China as a challenger or even a threat to the West?
No, on the contrary, this is China creates tremendous opportunities for other countries. I mean, if we go right back to the origins of economics, Adam Smith, and the founding work of Economics, the Wealth of Nations, its most fundamental thesis is that people cooperate with each other, are able to achieve higher standard of living than those who act separately. I mean, it's the principle of the division of labor, and this applies between countries. If a country tries to be self-sufficient, it will have a lower standard of living than if it cooperates with other countries in order to develop. And China's development, therefore, has taken not merely the Chinese people before, but it's the trade as China's the world's largest goods trading nation. Trade is a two-way benefit between countries. So China's not a threat to anybody. As regards its impact, in not merely the direct one, but the indirect one, it showed something which is extraordinary, which is, if we go back to 1949, China was almost the poorest country in the world. Only 10 countries are lower per capita GDP. Either next year or the year after, it will become, by World Bank standards, a high-income economy. That means in a single lifetime, it's gone from being almost the world's poorest country to a high-income economy. Now, the problem is that this will still leave 2/3 of the world's population in developing countries, not in high-income economies, and they should be studying China to say, not to mechanically copy China, but say, wow, this really worked well. What can we learn from it? So in both direct sense and an indirect sense, China is, on the contrary, great aid to the development of the rest of the world, not a threat to anybody.
And also, we know that modernizing a country with over 1.4 billion people is no small feat. So let's talk about the implications for the global economy, and I hope they are as significant as they sound. Mr. Ross, how do you think will China's modernization efforts impact the global economy?
Well, it will have two things. If we look at it very strategically, we're on the threshold of an extraordinary event in human history, which is, at the present time, only 16% of the world's population has the advantage of living in high-income economies. And China by itself is 18% of the world's population. And by World Bank standards, as I say, either next year or the year afterwards, it'll become a high-income economy. That means that China has lifted more people to the status of high-income economy, and all that goes with that. It's not just income, it's health, education, ability to protect the environment, cultural activities. It will have lifted more people to that status than all other countries in human history put together. So that's historically amazing. And then if we look at the immediate situation, obviously the world economy was hit by the pandemic. and all countries suffered economic setbacks. But China grew in that time 2.5 times as fast as the United States. It grew 6 times as fast as the European Union. That's in the last 3 years of the pandemic. And it accounts for about 36% of world economic growth, double that of the next country, which was the United States. So whether you look at it in a broad historical perspective, or you just simply take the responses to the pandemic, China's performance is extraordinarily good for the world economy. And we know that what's the discussion here this year is China's economy is going to speed up this year. There is a discussion, the growth target of 5% has been set compared to last year's, which was 3%. It may be slightly above, maybe slightly below, but the Chinese economy is going to speed up. Whereas we know that the US and European economy is going to slow down. This was even before the recent banking crisis in the United States, which will obviously have negative effects. So China continues to be the main engine of growth of the world economy. So both historically and in an immediate sense, China is the main locomotive of development of the world.
Let me go to Professor Gao. How do you think China's modernization path will affect the global south? You talked about how other emerging economies should be exploring their own way of development as well. Could you elaborate more on that?
I think if China can do it, many other countries can do it too. The key is whether you put a premium on several very important things of cardinal importance. As I mentioned, whether we promote peace, whether we maintain stability, whether we put top priority to growth and development, and whether we care to create an inclusive society rather than polarized society. Now, in that sense, every country has its own circumstances and different opportunities and challenges. As a matter of fact, every country has different natural endowments. For example, some countries are rich in oil and gas. Some countries are rich in agricultural produce, for example. Some countries are landlocked. Some countries have access to the coast, very easy access to the rest of the world. So each country is different. However, I would say from the Chinese perspective, because in China, we have one of the largest landmass in the world, population ranks #1, etc. And on China's mainland, we have about 31 different provinces and autonomous regions and municipalities directly under the State Council. And each province is more or less the size of another country, and big country on top of that. And each province in China is different. We have different natural endowments, circumstances, resources, etc. So I think from the Chinese perspective, we are accustomed to seeing that each of the 31 provinces need to move in the same direction of growth, but how to achieve growth is very different from one province to another. And the strategies which may work for the coastal provinces may completely fail in landlocked provinces. And then, for example, for Xinjiang Autonomous Region, it is a border province, border autonomous region, bordering with Central Asia. It has its own very unique advantages and disadvantages. So in a sense, I would say, the Global South should really care to look at China, how it promoted not only coastal regions, but hinterland regions, border regions, etc. And every region in China has been uplifted over the past 44 years or so. Now, the other thing is that when we talked about modernization 4 decades ago, we talked about modernization of industry, agriculture, science and technology, and national defense. Now, each sector is important. And by now, China is talking about agricultural scientific development, because agriculture in China is no longer pure traditional agriculture. It actually combines industrial output, for example, processing and digital economy, etc. And agriculture has been expanded to including rural region as a whole, as well as the farming population, because agriculture is not something in abstract. It is something real. It actually touches upon hundreds of millions of the Chinese people still living in the countryside. Now, when we talked about industry 44 years ago was basically, getting contracts from abroad as much as you can, processing that, making shirts, toys, shoes of all kinds. But industry in China is completely changed. We are talking about moving closer and closer to the cutting edge of science and technology. For example, AI, telecommunication, satellite communication.
Smart manufacturing.
Absolutely. AI and deep sea, deep space. You are talking about really cutting edge of mankind in science and technology. Therefore, I think what China has succeeded in should give aspirations and comfort to many countries in the global south. If China can do this, they can do that. And each country is really endowed in different ways. And when I look at the map of the global south, I sometimes cannot sleep because I see, wow, there are so many opportunities. If we really can engage with these countries, they have tremendous amount of potentials. They have tremendous amount of natural endowments which can really be emancipated for the benefit of their own people and also increase their international standing significantly. And what we in China have achieved for the past 44 years, if we can help these countries in the global south to achieve their great splendor and great success, it will be a better world.
Yes, thank you very much, Victor. Let me go to Ms. Bletas. Ms. Bletas, I would like to get your take on how do you understand the Chinese modernization and what do you understand of the significance of China exploring its own development model, its impact on the global economy?
Thank you. Well, I have followed up very closely the Chinese modernization in the last 30 years. And there is a tremendous change that has occurred in these years. And one thing I admire is the way China obtained to smoothly modernize itself without getting any uprights or having heavy problems. And I believe that this has been possible only for two reasons. One is, of course, the way China is governed, the political system, but also it is due to the people living in China. The Chinese people are deeply impressed by their thousands-long civilization, and they have a specific culture and idea on the way they have to be and they have to behave. It wouldn't be, I can't imagine a model like China to work, for example, in any of the European countries and much worse in Greece. So I believe that we have to take this deeply into consideration when we are considering how China can pass its own model as a role model to other countries and especially to European countries.
Ms. Bletas, we know that China has emphasized the importance of openness and inclusiveness in modernization, stressing the need for exchange and mutual learning to ensure a shared prosperity. What win-win cooperation do you envision with China?
Well, this is a very good question. Speaking from Greece, there are three particularities. The first one, which is very obvious, is the difference in size. Greece is a sovereign country and China is a sovereign country, but Greece has the size of half of Beijing, if not less. So we cannot compare really these two countries. On the other hand, Greece participates to the European Union and to the inner circle of the European Union. And this confers to our country a very different importance from its real size. However, even if we consider the EU is roughly 1/3 of what is China. And again, we have a very big difference in sizes. And finally, thirdly, Greece participates also to the group of the Eastern and Central Europe countries, which more or less are not EU countries. Very few of them are EU countries. So these three factors have to be taken into consideration when we are speaking of cooperation between our two countries. From the standards that have developed, we target to several different areas in which we possibly can cooperate, such as infrastructure, logistics, trade, investment, but also intangible assets like culture, education, tourism, think tanks, NGOs. Personally, I believe that due to the reasons I exposed before, we have to stress on these intangible assets. It is very difficult to consider that China can profit from deploying infrastructure, for example, to Greece due to the small size, or that Greece can go and trade in China, again, due to the small size. But we largely can profit from an exchange in culture, an exchange in education, and this is something that is happening right now. We have many of the Greek universities cooperating with Chinese universities because we are a country that is quite strong in this area. And China can benefit from our input as we can benefit from the technological input of China to us. This is something we can always keep in mind. Whatever we give and whatever cooperation we make has to be a really win-win cooperation, not in the papers win-win, but in the fact win-win. And in order for us to profit from what China has to input to us and China to profit from what we have to input to China, we have always to consider the parameters I mentioned before. So I believe that culture and education are the two really hard assets to when we speak for cooperation. On the other hand, tourism had a really good go before the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic stopped all this, and we are now expecting to see how the reopening of the frontiers can again enhance this tourist sector. Finally, and not less important, the logistics are also a very promising sector, especially with COSCO having acquired the operation of the Piraeus port for a long period of time in the future. This leads to a big facilitation for the Chinese trade towards Central and Eastern Europe. And logistics is also an promising sector. So I believe that if we take intelligent steps and we look forward how we can work our cooperation, there is a big path to really profit for both sides, both Greece and China, both Europe and China, from this cooperation. But I insist very much that we have to take into consideration not only the possibilities, but also the differences that exist between our two civilizations and our two sizes and group of countries.
Yes, very well said. Thank you very much, Ms. Bletas. And Victor, I think you have some input on that.
Yeah, if I may add a point, I think I listened very carefully to the distinguished lady, and I agree with all the important points. However, allow me to say one thing. From our perspective, Greece is such an important connectivity point, not only linking the different parts of Greece itself, but also as a connectivity nexus to the Balkan region and to the Central European region, or even to the North European region. This is because if, for example, the port facility in Greece can really be beefed up and become very efficient, then it may become a very important pathway to the rest of Europe. Why? Because Greece is much closer to the Suez Canal than, let's say, Rotterdam or Hamburg, for example. And Asian incoming trade from not only China, but Japan, Republic of Korea, and many others, and going forward, probably more from India, for example, they need to come through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean, and Greece is just there. Greece's geographical position is the key to its future development. Now, the distinguished lady talked about the size differences between China and Greece. That's for sure. But if we compare Greece with, let's say, Singapore is much smaller. But Singapore has become such an important logistics center. And if Greece can really focus on connectivity, logistics, improving the infrastructure projects like the port in particular, and the highways, railway connections with the rest of Europe, then I would say, and I can bet my house on that, the connectivity will lead to greater efficiency and productivity in Greece, and the living standards of the Greek people will be significantly uplifted.
See, this is one example of how China's modernization can inspire other countries' development pattern. Ms. Bletas, please.
If I can say something, yes, maybe it was not clear what I said. I completely agree with your distinguished guest. And I myself stressed out that the logistics is a field where we can have a very good cooperation. If I stressed on the size, and I didn't stress on Greece's size, I also stressed on the whole European size, which is about 1/3 of China. And I also stressed on the civilization factors is that I believe that whatever we do in this cooperation field has to be carefully designed in order to be positive, both for China and for us. This is what I said. I completely agree that, of course, there is a big field of cooperation in the logistics areas, and that from there on to trade and to going on to Central and Northern Europe and Eastern Europe. All this is completely true. But we have to take careful steps in order to make sure that whatever we do is profitable and is a win-win cooperation for both our countries and China. This was just a remark.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bletas. Great input there. Now let's zoom in on the two sessions. So this is two sessions with our changes to China's institutional structure, its legislation, policy environment, which will have a profound impact on the economy and businesses in the coming year and beyond. So let me go to Professor Gao first. What is your observation, the key takeaways from the two sessions in regard to China's modernization?
Well, the two sessions came with a big bang and finished with a big bang, and it's a great success. I'm so encouraged to see that now we have a completely new lineup of the President, Vice President of the People's Republic of China, Chairman, Vice Chairman of the Standing Committee of the MPC, the new Premier, and a new lineup of Vice Premier and State Councillors, for example. This means that for the coming 5 years, the top leadership has been fully lined up and fully empowered to lead the nation. And this bodes very well because the coming 5 years will be crucial in China's modernization, industrialization, and it will really push China further into the future. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure either at the end of this 5-year period around 2028 or no later than 2030, the overall size of the Chinese economy measured by official exchange rate will be number one in the world.
You will bet your house on that too, I believe.
I have 2 houses.
Yeah, Mr. Ross, thank you for waiting all this time. I do have a number of questions for you. First of all, focus on the two sessions. Which specific policies do you believe will ensure the successful achievement of key targets in China's modernization efforts, like what we always talk about, the high quality development, common prosperity, and green economy?
Well, I think the key to the success of China's economy is recent one is the structure which was created in 1978 and which has continued to the present day and which has been maintained, which is the combination of, on the one hand, very large companies which are owned by the state and which provide a solid backbone for the economy, and incidentally give it tremendous anti-crisis potential. I mean, one of the things that has become very dramatic is, of course, the Western economies have passed through two very severe crises in the last, in slightly over a decade. First, the international financial crisis, and then the very deleterious economic effects of the pandemic. And now we have to see, we are at the moment in a new banking crisis in the United States, literally as we speak. Having proclaimed that their economy was very stable, suddenly you have in one weekend the second and third largest bank collapses in US history, which indicated things were not as stable as was claimed. So these state companies in China, because they can move their level of investment up and down, gives China much, much stronger anti-crisis measures that it can take than other countries. And at the same time, it has a very dynamic private sector, which is growing, we may say, within that framework. And therefore, China has maintained this structure, which is creating the development of the two. And then this is backed up by state policies, for example, on research and development. I mean, the last time was an international comparable study by the OECD of research and development expenditure. China's was about 85% of the United States, but it's growing much faster than the United States. China's research and development spending has grown at 11% a year, and the US at 4% a year. So probably already China's research and development expenditure is probably higher in real terms than the United States, and certainly by 2030 will certainly be bigger than the United States. So therefore, this is the underlying scientific and research development for China's high quality, high technology development. And these are the policies which are going to continue to ensure the success of the economy, and the goal which has been set basically to double per capita GDP by 2035. These mechanisms which have been so successful will continue to ensure that China achieves this target. That's the key take which comes out of the two sessions for me, that the policies are in place which will enable it to hit these targets.
Mr. Ross, since we were on the topic of the ongoing banking system crisis, I would like to get more of your opinions on that. Do you think this is the beginning of the new Lehman moment? What's next for the Fed?
Well, it's a bit too early to tell, as I say. I personally don't think that it's a new Lehman moment, because the international imbalances are less bad than they were in 2008. In 2008, the United States was running a gigantic balance of payments deficit, which had been around 6% of GDP, and this was completely unsustainable. Now this has been much more cut back to about half that. So I could be wrong. These are probability things. So I think this is going to be a bad crisis, but not as bad as 2008. But we will have to see. But what is very clear is that this was entirely predictable. I mean, I've been actually tweeting, putting out on Weibo the analysis of what has been happening before this broke out. It sounds slightly technical, but it's a question of what is called the inversion of the yield curve. It means that the short-term interest rates in the United States become higher than long-term runs. This is very, very rare. It only occurs about once every 10 years, and it started to occur last July. And therefore, you had, on the one hand, propaganda by the United States saying that the situation was very good, and President Biden was doing press conferences to say how wonderful the situation was. But if you looked at the money, as opposed to the words, something was going very seriously wrong. And it's been doing so since about July last year, and then it exploded just during the last weekend. And this is showing you that the situation in the US economy is not stable, and it's going to have negative consequences, particularly in the struggle against inflation. The Fed is going to be more worried that its increase in its interest rates is going to lead to a very disastrous crisis in the financial system. It's going to be more cautious, and that means it's going to be more difficult to control inflation. And we know over the medium term, inflation is one of the most destabilizing things you can possibly have in the economy. So this is therefore, if you've put a gun against my head, say exactly what's going to happen. I don't think it'll be as bad as Lehman, but it is going to be negative from the point of view of the long-term stability of the US economy, because it's going to make it more difficult to control inflation within the US.
Well, before I let you go, Mr. Ross, what topics or issues from the two sessions did you pay the most attention to?
Well, I'm an economist, so I paid most attention to the growth rate and the discussions on the economy. I mean, I followed the other things, the discussion on security and other things, but I've been writing on China's economy for more than 30 years, so I'm obviously looking at these types of things. I mean, what is the effect is not simply just the economy. It's what it means for the Chinese people's living standards. I mean, the whole purpose of economics and the reason study is not so that you can have more steel and concrete. It's so that people can have more leisure time and more education and live longer and have greater cultural activities. That's the purpose of the economy. And that's what's achieved. I mean, even at the times, I've been working in China now for what? Let me work it out, 14 years, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. Even then, the improvement in of people's living standards, their ability to take holidays, the amount of leisure activities, how much easier it is to get around the country now because of the high-speed train systems. This is even in the time I've been there, let alone for somebody who's lived in China their whole life. Their life is just getting better and better. And therefore, this is a product definitely of the economic development. And so it's the improvement of the life of the Chinese people. That's why I'm most impressed by it coming out of the two sessions, even if I've followed the economy a bit more than some other people may be doing.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. And I would like to toss my final question to Victor Gao. I mean, we can go on forever if we discuss this, but that's all the time we have for today. But before we go, I wanted to get your one piece of advice for global investors if they're closely watching China's economy this year.
I think keep faith in China and hope for the best in China. I think China will continue to be the main engine of growth in the world, and the Chinese growth will contribute tremendously to global peace and stability. A stronger China is a friend of all countries in the world. China is a major force for peace and stability, and China opposes war of all kinds. So let's have a peaceful world.
Have confidence in China.
Absolutely.
Right. Thank you very much. And I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. And let me introduce again our guests. We have Professor Victor Gao with us. We have Mr. Ross and Ms. Bletas joining us from London and Athens. Thank you both for your great insights. And we really appreciate your time. Thank you also to our viewers for being with us for this hour. And that's all for our special program, Chinese Paths to Modernization and the World. Till next time, bye for now. I'm Lily Lu.